Hello, my name's Roger Watson and welcome to this session on systematic review. This is a very introductory session. It's very general and you'll learn about various aspects of systematic review. What you won't learn here is about, for example, how to combine search terms using Boolean operators or how to do a meta-analysis. If you're going to undertake a systematic review, I strongly recommend that you undertake some further training. Whenever I want to find anything out, my first port of call is always Wikipedia. And Wikipedia has got a definition covering a couple of PowerPoints here of systematic reviews. The highlights in blue here are, of course, links on the Wikipedia page. Definition goes like this. I'll just read it out. Systematic reviews are types of literature reviews that collect and critically analyse multiple research studies or papers using methods that are selected before one or more research questions are formulated, and then finding and analysing studies that relate to and answer those questions in a structured methodology. They are designed to provide a complete, exhaustive summary of current literature relevant to a research question. Systematic reviews of randomised controlled trials are key in the practice of evidence-based medicine, and a review of existing studies is often quicker and cheaper than embarking on a new study. Before we move on, I'll mention that evidence-based medicine falls under the general umbrella of evidence-based practice, and that evidence-based nursing also falls under there, and that systematic reviews are useful in providing evidence for all of these areas. What I'll be concerned with here generally is evidence-based practice. To continue the definition, an understanding of systematic reviews and how to implement them in practice is highly recommended for professionals involved in the delivery of health care. Besides health interventions, systematic reviews may examine clinical tests, public health interventions, environmental interventions, social interventions, adverse effects, and economic evaluations. Systematic reviews are not limited to medicine, and are quite common in all other sciences where data are collected, published in the literature, and an assessment of methodological quality for a precisely defined subject would be helpful. And now a somewhat potted history of systematic reviews. Years ago, journals used to publish letters. They still do, but at one time letters was where opinions were expressed, usually by individuals, sometimes by several people, but they were just opinions. And these have been kind of elevated into opinion pieces, and many editorials are opinion pieces, usually of an individual or a group. Now, these may well be based on several sources of evidence, but the evidence isn't gathered systematically, nor is it analysed systematically. Slightly more rigorous, and these were around when I began in science and nursing, were reviews, but these were not systematic, and in fact they were usually blatantly selective. And it has to be said that 25 plus years ago it was exceedingly laborious to do a review. Things had to be searched by hand and it took a long time, and the kind of databases that we use now just weren't available in those days. However, these days, in the last 20 to 25 years, systematic reviews and meta-analysis have become much easier due to the advent of the internet and the development of more sophisticated databases. We're not going to look here at meta-analysis in any detail. These are specifically for randomized controlled trials. We'll look at the end of the session about how to interpret a systematic review and meta-analysis, but we won't deal with how to do one. There are variations on this: narrative analysis, integrated reviews, and meta-synthesis, and the definitions here are somewhat overlapping, but these deal with evidence other than randomized controlled trials and include qualitative studies. And more recently we have realist reviews, which apply realistic evaluation methods to evaluate the data and express this in terms of contexts, mechanisms, and outcomes. Before we proceed, I want to be quite clear about one thing: the relationship between systematic reviews and meta-analysis. You will sometimes Hear it told, and our medical colleagues are especially guilty of this, that if you're not doing a meta-analysis, you're not doing a systematic review. And I want to be quite clear here, and I'm not alone in this view, that that is absolute nonsense. Systematic reviews are a very general term, and meta-analysis are one particular kind of systematic review. So if you're doing a systematic review using the kind of systematic methods that I'm going to outline here, you are doing a systematic review. You do not have to be doing a meta-analysis to be doing a systematic review. So, methods of systematic reviewing. Well, there are different systems. The gold standard in the area, and really first off the blocks many years ago, was the Cochrane system. And this is available online. You can find Cochrane reviews online, free to look at, free to download, and anybody, provided they have the right training and download the right software, and can get the funding, because you need to fund a proper team to do a Cochrane review. They're not an easy undertaking. Then anybody can undertake a Cochrane review. They're very rigorous and are subjected to very rigorous peer review, and of course have a very rigorous methodology. Originally mainly based around randomized controlled trials, although Cochrane reviews are a little bit wider these days. Got to mention the Joanna-Briggs system. This is specific to nursing. It originated in Australia, but it's spread worldwide. And this is, as I say, specific to nursing. The features of Joanna-Briggs are that they synthesize evidence in nursing and provide guidelines, which Cochrane explicitly don't do. You also have to pay to do Joanna-Briggs reviews, because you have to undertake the training, and you have to pay to access the evidence that they produce. I have to say that I've never really seen the necessity for having the Joanna-Briggs system, but many people do. It's very popular, and as I say, it is spread across the world. And finally, well, not finally, but finally in the ones I want to mention, because there are other systems, there's the York Centre for Reviews and Dissemination. Now, there's a great deal of overlap between the Cochrane and the Centre for Reviews and Dissemination these days. At one time, the Centre for Reviews and Dissemination was a little bit more liberal in its methodology, and as I say, Cochrane was the gold standard, but because Cochrane now does consider qualitative evidence reviews and surveys and all sorts of other data, there's a great deal of overlap between the two. But the common features of Cochrane and the Centre for Reviews and Dissemination, also known as the CRD, which distinguish it from Joanna-Briggs, is that everything is free. The methodology is freely available and the reviews are freely available. Systematic reviews have got a range of common features. One of the main features is that a systematic review has a research question. In other words, a systematic review is a bona fide research method. There will also be a range of defined parameters for the review, including the search terms, in other words, the words that you use to retrieve the data from the databases that you've decided to look at. Now, search terms can be used in a variety of ways, and they can be combined in a variety of ways using what are called Boolean operators, essentially and, or, and bracketing. This is quite an expert job, and I would really recommend that you take some further training. If you need advice on this, your local information scientist, what used to be called a librarian, at your university or hospital library is the person to see. There will be date limits. Sometimes the date limits go from the origin of the database up to the present time. Sometimes that's not necessary because there will have been some other kind of review done in the interim, so you can do it from the date of that review or around that review. Sometimes it's simply not feasible to look at every single piece of data that's ever been available. Now, there are different views on this, but sometimes it really isn't necessary to go all the way back to the beginning of the database. Sometimes the last 5 to 10 years is sufficient. Then you need to define, just as you would for any research project, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Which papers are you going to include in terms of subject and level of paper and type of methodology, for example, or even the type of journal. And for example, are you going to look at English language only or at a range of languages? And also, what kinds of papers are you specifically going to exclude? You need to apply some system of quality assessment. The common ones these days are CASP and SIGN. But there are other systems available. There are a range of systems available for randomized controlled trials. And quality assessment is necessary because if you pull down a range of papers from the literature, all, for example, purporting to use randomized controlled trials, you have to come up with some assessment of the quality of those randomized controlled trials. Have they used the appropriate randomization techniques? Have they avoided bias? Have they analyzed it properly, for example? And the quality assessment tools help you to evaluate that. Then you need to synthesize it, bring it all together. You don't just list the papers and say so-and-so said this and the next person said that. You need to do that at one level as part of your data presentation, usually in a table. But you need to synthesize it and bring it together and say what gaps you've filled with this review, what's new, what remains to be done. Very often you are trying to formulate your own research question for a study using a review, so you need to state what that will be. Then, I've put in brackets here meta-analysis. It's actually very rare in nursing to do meta-analysis. It's becoming more common, but the kind of evidence available doesn't really lend itself to meta-analysis. And there are other mathematical ways of bringing data together as well, but we won't cover these here. But if you're going to do a meta-analysis, a little bit like if you're going to do any kind of review, you need to have some specialist training. And once you've done your review, it's obligatory to report it. And in fact, these days, you're strongly encouraged to register a review on a database called Prospero, which we'll come to later. And then you can go back to that Prospero database and report your findings. But also, it's a very good thing to do to write up your study, publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. Peer-reviewed journals very much favour reviews because they tend to be highly read, highly downloaded, and of course, highly cited. Mentioning publication brings us nicely to the PRISMA reporting system. I'll explain what PRISMA is. It's a generic but rigorous process for reporting systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and it's one to which all high-quality international peer-reviewed journals adhere. In other words, the editor-in-chief of a journal of that nature expects to see you using the PRISMA guidance, and I'll show you what these involve. It's also worth consulting PRISMA before you conduct a review. It's not a how to do a review recipe, however, reporting the review will depend on how well you do it, and you have to check that the key features are there. And I always advise people to check PRISMA at the start of a review. If you want to find out the origins of PRISMA, there's this paper on PRISMA in the British Medical Journal, worth looking at. PRISMA has an excellent web page, and it's always worth checking for an updated version of the web page because new material is added all the time. This is the landing page. Up on the top right you'll find the important or key documents as they're described there, the checklist and the flow diagram, which we will return to. There's also the PRISMA statement, which is the one that's published in the BMJ, and also the explanation and elaboration, which is published in a PLOS ONE journal. Below that you'll see the Prospero website, and that's where you can register systematic reviews. We'll return to that in a few slides. And below that, Equator, and Equator is a system that gathers together all these publishing standards. PRISMA is just one of these. Another common example is CONSORT, which is used to report randomized controlled trials. PRISMA has a number of extensions which we'll look at next. There's a range of Prisma extensions, and we'll cover these over the next few slides. The first of these extensions is the Prisma P, and Prisma P is advice on how to present a systematic review protocol. And a systematic review protocol is the kind of thing that you would put up on the Prospero website. There's also some relatively new guidance on conducting reviews of individual patient data, systematic reviews. This is a fairly expert area, I have to say. And then a newer area on Prisma for network analysis. If you don't know what network meta-analysis is, then it's a meta-analysis in which multiple treatments, that is 3 or more, are being compared using both direct and indirect comparisons of interventions within randomized controlled trials, and indirect comparisons across trials based on a common comparator. Again, quite new, actually quite complex, and it looks a little bit like this. You can combine direct and indirect evidence across trials and within randomized controlled trials. I think it's unlikely at this stage in nursing that many people would be embarking on this, but I thought it might just be worth showing you what this means. And there are also Prisma guidelines for producing abstracts for systematic reviews. And Prisma also produces guidance on equity and making sure that reviews cover all age groups, all economic groups, social groups, ethnicity, and so forth. And there are a range of extensions in development, so it's well worth keeping your eye on the Prisma webpage. For example, there are extensions in development for looking at systematic reviews of data involving children specifically. So here's the Prisma checklist. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it tells you what the essential features of any report for a systematic review are. It's got a couple of pages. It tells you, for example, what should be in the title, what should be in the abstract, and what you should identify in the methods. And it also tells you what to present in the results section, the discussion, and what to say about the funding, if any. Now, you wouldn't necessarily in every review be able to tick every single box. You should tick the ones that you can and explain what you've done and explain what, for example, you haven't been able to do and why, and bring that up perhaps in the limitations to the study in the discussion. But for example, you wouldn't be looking at risk of bias across studies unless you were looking at randomized controlled trials. So in addition to the Prisma checklist, which has to be presented, you should also present your data in a Prisma flow diagram. And the Prisma flow diagram looks like this. It's a method for identifying all the papers that you found from the various databases that you searched, how many duplicates you found and removed, how many records you screened using your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then how many you screened for quality and how many were left, and if you did a systematic review and meta-analysis, how many were actually entered into the meta-analysis. The important point about this flow diagram is that all of the bottom levels should add up to the level above until you come to the same total of papers at the top that you started with. Every paper needs to be accounted for. I've mentioned Prospero already, and Prospero is a system for registering systematic reviews, and it's run by the National Health Service Institute for Health Research and the York Centre for Reviews and Dissemination. There's a website, and on the website you can easily register your review. It doesn't cost anything, and you can search for previously registered reviews. And this is an outline of what you'll find on Prospero. I've also mentioned evaluation tools for evaluating the quality of the articles that you retrieve and review. And first of all, I'm going to look at the CASP system. CASP stands for the Critical Appraisal Skills Program, and you can find this on the internet. Here's the landing page, and you can see at the toolbar along the top there that there are CASP tools and checklists, and there's a range of these. For example, there are CASP checklists for systematic reviews, for qualitative studies, randomized controlled trials, case control studies, diagnostic checklists, cohort studies, economic evaluations, and clinical prediction rule checklists. The most common ones that you'll probably be using are the systematic review, randomized controlled trial, and the qualitative checklist. In addition, there are the SIGN guidelines. SIGN stands for the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network. And the SIGN guidelines are available on a web page. These are really more designed for designing systematic reviews rather than evaluation, but they can be used for evaluation as well, but well worth checking. And here you'll find a list of methodology checklists for systematic reviews and meta-analysis, randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, case control studies, and diagnostic studies. I have to say that the CASP tools are probably the more commonly used. Of course, there are some excellent books published on how to do systematic reviews, and this is just one example by Josette Bettany-Saltykov, from which I've taken the example of PICO and PO, which is a helpful way of formulating a research question for a systematic review, as follows. PICO stands for population, intervention, comparison, or outcomes. So the population is the people you're looking at, the intervention is what's being done to them. A comparison group may well be the control group, but not necessarily so. And the outcomes are what you're expecting from the intervention. So these are specifically for intervention studies, of course. That would include randomized controlled trials. So here's an example of how to use it. For example 1, in patients with acute asthma, how effective are antibiotics as compared to standard care at reducing sputum production and coughing? The patients with acute asthma are the population, the antibiotics are the intervention, standard care is the comparison, and the outcomes are the reduction of sputum production and coughing, and there are 3 other examples given there. As I say, PICO is specifically for intervention studies. There's also a system called PEO, and PEO is for qualitative studies. P again stands for population, E is for the exposure, and O is the outcomes. So for example 1, in teenagers with spinal deformity, the development of a spinal deformity and the patient's views. So teenagers with spinal deformity are the population, having a spinal deformity is the exposure, and what the views are is the outcome. And again, there are 3 other examples given there. Now I just want to run through with the use of an excellent paper from the Journal of the American Geriatric Society by Hansen et al. On the oral feeding options for people with dementia, a systematic review. I want to run through the main features of a good systematic review. This particular systematic review used 2 questions, but what I'll do is illustrate what the main features are and how they've used them. First of all, they used a PICO strategy for formulating the research question. They added T, which was the time frame, because this is an intervention, and specifically nutritional intervention study. They wanted to add the length of time for which interventions took place. You can adapt the PICO criteria in any way you want, and that's a good example of doing just that. So the population of interest was adults aged over 50, inclusion was having high calorie, high protein supplement diets and so forth. The comparison was any comparison group, including randomized controlled trial groups with controls, and the outcome was the effect of the nutritional intervention, weight change, wound healing, or whatever. And also they wanted to look at studies which had a follow-up of only 1 month or longer. Then they clearly defined their search terms, and they used all available databases. You can see here the Boolean operators, the ORs, and so forth. I won't go into that in too much detail, but basically they used 5 different search strategies here to retrieve the papers that they wanted. Then they produced a Prisma type diagram which showed the number of papers they initially searched, over 1,000 from one database, an extra 65 by hand searching. Then they removed duplicates, got that down to about 900, and then they looked at full text articles, roughly 100, and then using the research criteria that they set, they excluded the vast majority and looked at 25 papers, 13 of which looked at the first research question and 12 of which looked at the second. They produced their data by means of a table. This is a basic table just showing what the study was, what the number of people in the study was, what the intervention was, what the outcome measure was, and whether or not the study made a difference. And a further table looking at the same studies, but here in slightly more detail and evaluating the quality. They looked at the quality of the study and also the likelihood of bias in the randomized controlled trial or experimental studies that they looked at. In the methods, they explained exactly how they carried out the review. Another very essential feature, they said that 2 investigators graded each study. Then they said how they graded the strength of evidence, A if randomized, placebo-controlled, B if randomized without concealment, C if not randomized, and they looked at risk of bias by looking at whether the studies were blinded, double-blinded, and so forth, applying the specific criteria of RCTs. And finally, they obviously discussed the results, and this is just a really good example of how to begin a discussion, not just for a review, but for any paper. The systematic review summarizes research in oral feeding and dementia, and then it gives the main results. Then they go on to discuss it in detail. So this paper is easily available. You can find it by searching the Journal of the American Geriatric Society using Hansen et al. Or the title, or you can email me and I can send you a copy for use only by yourself in connection with this particular session. And it really is an excellent and I think almost flawless example of how to present a systematic review, and indeed in this case not quite a meta-analysis, but one looking at randomized controlled trials. Next, and quite briefly, I want to look at rapid evidence assessments, REAs. There are various links to these given here. Rapid evidence assessments are used mainly for policies and used by government departments to, as the name suggests, quickly get evidence on whether or not policies are working and to help them make decisions. But rapid evidence assessments are now being applied a little bit more widely within clinical areas, for example. The reason being that full systematic reviews are very laborious, they take a long time to do, and of course sometimes we need evidence a little bit quicker, and rapid evidence assessments are very rigorous. They will not look at absolutely every part of the evidence, but they will get the main papers and will give some idea of where a field is moving. But they make certain compromises in the sense of doing the review. So, for example, they may not necessarily look at all the what's called the grey literature, the literature that isn't immediately available through databases. They may not look at languages beyond English, for example, and they may only consider one particular kind of study. But don't be fooled by the name rapid evidence assessment. They're essentially no less rigorous, and they do take some time to do. They're not really that quick to do, but they don't require the full length of time and the full application of methods that full systematic reviews need. And this is just a schematic diagram showing where rapid evidence assessments lie in terms of confidence compared with narrative reviews and quick scoping reviews. They're better, but not quite as good as full systematic reviews. However, they are rigorous and they are very useful. So now let's have a look at meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is a statistical procedure that integrates the results of several independent studies considered to be combinable. Well-conducted meta-analysis allow a more objective appraisal of the evidence than traditional narrative reviews, provide a more precise estimate of a treatment effect, and may explain heterogeneity between the results of individual studies. Ill-conducted meta-analysis, on the other hand, may be biased owing to the exclusion of relevant studies or the inclusion of inadequate studies. And finally, misleading analysis can generally be avoided if a few basic principles are observed. So meta-analysis apply to very specifically designed studies, usually to randomized, double-blind, controlled trials. If you want to read a good article about meta-analysis principles and procedures, which is actually quite old now, this article by Egger et al. From the BMJ in 1997 is well worth reading. The results of studies from meta-analysis all have to be expressed in the same way, even if the data in the original studies are not expressed that way. And software is available to help you extract the data and express it appropriately so that the studies may be directly compared. And the data are normally expressed then as either odds ratio or relative risk. I don't want to burden you with any equations here or with the statistics or the probability theory behind this. However, I do want to try and explain what odds ratio and relative risk are and what the difference between them is. They are similar, but they are different. First of all, the odds ratio. The odds is the number of patients who fulfill the criteria for a given endpoint divided by the number of patients who don't. So, for example, the odds of diarrhea during treatment with an antibiotic in a group of 10 patients may be 4 to 6. 4 with diarrhea divided by 6 without, which gives you 0.66. In a control group, in other words, people not being treated with antibiotics, the odds may be 1 to 9, 1 with diarrhea to 10 without diarrhea. 1 divided by 9 is 0.11. So the ratio between those two odds, or the odds ratio, which is 0.66 divided by 0.11, is 6. Now this actually means there's a much greater likelihood of developing diarrhea in a group of people treated with antibiotics than in a group of people not treated. If the odds ratio was 1, it would mean that there was no difference between the two groups. And if it was less than 1, it would in fact mean that people treated with antibiotics were less likely to develop diarrhea. However, that's a very clear odds ratio there, and that's a very large odds ratio. Next, the risk or the relative risk means much the same thing. Risk is the number of patients who fulfill the criteria for a given endpoint divided by the total number of patients. So in the example above, the risks would be 4 and 10 in the treatment group and 1 and 10 in the control group, giving 0.4 and 0.1 respectively. If you divide 0.4 by 0.1, you get a risk or a risk ratio or relative risk of 4. In other words, the 4 times greater risk of having diarrhea in the treatment group than in the control group. The results of systematic reviews with meta-analysis are combined and presented visually in plots like this called forest plots. And if you're using the type of software that you can use to extract the data in a systematic review, that software will also automatically generate these forest plots. Now, you may or may not have seen these before. What I want to convey here is how you interpret a forest plot. In other words, what are the main features of a forest plot. So using this diagram, we'll look at the features of a forest plot. The diagram's got 4 regions in it. Just bear in mind that not every set of meta-analysis is presented in the same way, but this is a particularly good example. Also bear in mind we don't actually know what's being studied here. This is a purely theoretical example. So this diagram's got 4 regions. On the left, it gives you the study or the subgroups that are being looked at, and these are denoted by references which can then be checked in the reference list, where you can look for the reference and you can actually look at the studies yourself and look at the data yourself and make your own mind up about the studies. Next, you've got the treatment and the control groups and the numbers in them, and these are added up at the foot. In the third area, you've got the actual forest plot, which we will come back to. And on the right-hand side, you've got, in this case, the risk ratios, not the odds ratios. They've been used to represent and summarize the results, along with their confidence intervals. So what's represented in the forest plot is a combination of the data on the left and right columns of the actual forest plot. So what you're looking at in the forest plot are these squares, which represent the effect of any particular trial or where it lies. And first of all, there's a line of no effect, which is represented by the value 1, whether you're using risk ratios or odds ratios. And let's assume here that to the right of that, where the odds ratios or the risk ratios in this case are greater than 1, that the treatment group has more effect than the control group. In other words, your treatment works. And to the left of that is an area where the control group actually works better than the treatment group. That may not necessarily be the interpretation here, but that's the interpretation I'm putting upon it, and that's the usual interpretation. So we've got these squares which represent where the effect of an individual trial lies. A line of no effect, the squares lie on one side of that than the other, and you're already beginning to get the idea looking at that if my interpretation is correct, that the trials tend to favour the control groups. In other words, the treatment doesn't seem to work very well. Around each of these squares is plotted the confidence intervals. This tells you the likelihood of finding the value within that range, and the larger the confidence intervals, the less confidence you can actually have in that particular result. The size of the squares represents the power, which is clearly related to the size of the studies. You can tell that by looking down the column to the left there. And you can see that there's a reciprocal relationship between the power and the confidence intervals. The larger the power, the smaller the confidence intervals. So that tells you that the larger studies are essentially the better. And finally, there's a summary diamond which summarizes the effect of all the trials together. And here it lies clearly on the side of favoring the control group. Now, the great thing about systematic reviews is that they are cumulative. This is a snapshot in time when these studies were collected and analysed, but further studies can be added to this, and of course the summary point may well shift. You can also see the value of doing meta-analysis and not relying on individual studies, and particularly not relying on small studies which will have large confidence intervals. So we need to do more rigorous studies with large sample sizes, and you can see the sophistication of meta-analysis, which allows us not only to combine studies but subsequently to add studies to that analysis and find out more about where the actual effects of a treatment lie. We can also do a sensitivity analysis, and a sensitivity analysis looks at the same results from a series of trials but using different ways of interpreting them. For example, using different models, fixed effects, random effects models, and so forth. But this is a little bit beyond the present presentation, just to show you what the possibilities are, and in fact to show you what a sophisticated science systematic reviewing with meta-analysis actually is. So to summarize, meta-analysis should be as carefully planned as any other research project and should have a detailed protocol prepared in advance. You should define beforehand the eligibility criteria for studies and search strategies, and these are central to high quality meta-analysis. And the graphical display of results for meta-analysis allows a common scale in which all the studies can be compared, and you can also get an idea of the heterogeneity or the differences between the studies in terms of quality, sample size, outcome, and so forth. Different statistical methods exist for combining the data. There's no single correct method. That's why these sensitivity analysis can be done to see if there's a difference being generated by different methods of presenting the results. So sensitivity analysis is essential if different outcomes are being used. And finally, just a very quick word on how much journals like systematic reviews. Review papers are very important to academic journals, and I edit the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and I'm just going to show you how important it is to us. Here's a recent table from my journal looking at citations in 2017 and looking at the top cited articles, and in the top 10 cited articles, 5 of these were systematic reviews. This looks at competitor analysis, and you see a similar pattern in the top 10. 3 of these were systematic reviews. So systematic reviews are very much favoured by journal editors, and of course they're favoured because they're cited, but it also shows that they are highly used. They're valued by PhD students and by other researchers. So thank you very much for listening. These are my contact details, my email. I'm also visible on ORCID, where you can check my publications and research record. You can follow me on Twitter, and I'm also available on WeChat. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and don't hesitate to contact me if you have any queries or questions.